800,000 square feet of enclosed retail, more than 60 stores, 4,200 parking spaces. In its first full year, Dixie Square Mall in Harvey, Illinois, pulled in over $40 million and forced a competing shopping center to lose 20% of its sales overnight. That was 1967. Today, the site is 39 acres of empty dirt, weeds, and silence. The building stood abandoned for 34 years before anyone could afford to tear it down. How does a place that big, that successful, die that completely, and then refuse to disappear? In 1889, a Chicago lumberman named Turlington W. Harvey bought a stretch of prairie 20 miles south of the city and announced he was going to build a perfect town. Not just any town. A model community designed from scratch as a combination of capitalism and Christianity. No saloons. No vice. Clean streets, good schools, steady factory work for honest families. He modeled it loosely after Pullman, the company town a few miles north, but with one crucial difference: Harvey wanted his residents to own their homes. The Harvey Land Association advertised in religious publications across the Midwest, promising skilled laborers a place where work and faith could live side by side. By 1900, the town had 5,000 residents, a bank, 11 industrial enterprises, and a name that carried the weight of its founders' ambitions. The temperance experiment lasted 6 years. In 1895, residents voted by a narrow margin to allow saloons, and the dream of a dry utopia quietly dissolved. But the factories kept coming. The Whiting Corporation set up shop in 1894, manufacturing overhead cranes and foundry equipment. American Stove arrived in 1897. By the early 20th century, Harvey had become what its founders always intended beneath the religious gloss: a blue-collar powerhouse. Bliss and Laughlin rolled cold steel. Wyman Gordon forged heavy metal parts. Alice Chalmers built industrial machinery. The Illinois Central Railroad ran straight through the middle of town, physically dividing residential neighborhoods from the factory floor. And every morning, thousands of men crossed those tracks to work shifts that paid well enough to buy a house, raise a family, and never think about leaving. By 1960, Harvey's population had climbed to just under 30,000. Sinclair Oil had opened a 38-acre research laboratory in 1948. The school system, anchored by Thornton High School, was considered among the best in the south suburbs. The town hummed with the kind of post-war confidence that defined a generation of American communities. Places where a man without a college degree could walk into a factory on Monday and sign a mortgage on Friday. But something bigger was happening across the country, and Harvey sat right in the path of it. President Eisenhower had signed the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956, authorizing 41,000 miles of interstate highways. The concrete was still being poured, but the consequences were already rolling in. Families were scattering outward from Chicago, from Detroit, from every major city, chasing cheap land and new construction and the promise that the suburbs were where the future lived. Between 1950 and 1960, America's suburban population nearly doubled, and all those new families, spread across all those new subdivisions, needed somewhere to shop. That need produced an idea, and the idea had a name. Victor Gruen, a Jewish architect who had fled Vienna in 1938 with no English and no money, had risen to become the most influential retail designer in the country. Gruen despised the American suburban landscape. He called its commercial strips avenues of horror, flanked by the greatest collection of vulgarity: billboards, motels, gas stations, shanties, car lots. His answer was the enclosed shopping mall, a climate-controlled, inward-facing world modeled after the 19th-century European arcades he remembered from his youth. In 1956, he opened Southdale Center in Edina, Minnesota, the first fully enclosed, climate-controlled shopping mall in the United States. He called its central atrium a garden court of perpetual spring. It had sculptures, trees, a cafe, a bird cage. Gruen did not see himself building a store. He believed he was building the new town square, the community center that sprawling suburbs desperately lacked. Developers across America took notice, not of the community center part. They noticed the money. By the early 1960s, enclosed malls were rising in suburbs from coast to coast, and the south suburbs of Chicago were no exception. Harvey sat at a crossroads, 20 miles from downtown Chicago, accessible from 3 major highways, surrounded by working families with factory paychecks and no regional shopping center to spend them in. 60 acres of land along Dixie Highway, where a rundown 9-hole golf course called Dixie High had been slowly dying since the 1950s, sat waiting. The fairways were overgrown. Locals remembered paying $1 or $2 for a round in the old days, dodging garter snakes near the 9th hole. The course had outlived its purpose. The land had not. In 1961, a developer named Meyer C. Weiner began negotiations to buy those 60 acres. It took 3 years of dealing before the sale closed in January 1964. By then, Weiner had already assembled a team, Robert E. Freiling, T.C. McDonald, and formed the Robert Meyer Corporation. They hired architects from Grand Rapids, Michigan. They drew up plans for something Harvey had never seen. And across town, in the factories and the neighborhoods and the schools, nobody knew it yet, but their city was about to get a new center of gravity. The building permit told the story in numbers. Permit number 1355, issued September 22, 1965, listed a construction cost of more than $7.6 million. But that figure covered only the physical structure. By the time Meyer C. Weiner and his partners, Robert E. Freiling and T.C. McDonald, operating together as the Robert Meyer Corporation, finished buying land, signing tenants, paving lots, and running utilities across 60 acres, the total project cost would climb to an estimated $25 million. In 1965 money, that was a bet big enough to build a small town, which in a way was exactly what they were doing. Weiner hired the architectural firm of Hornbach and Steenwick out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the design they delivered was meant to feel like nothing Harvey had ever seen. The exterior walls featured panels of black glass on every sun-facing surface, not for style but for function. The dark glass cut glare and reduced heat inside the corridors, a detail most shoppers would never notice but would feel every time they walked through the doors on an August afternoon. Inside, the concourses were lined with artificial plants imported from France, Germany, and Japan. Lush, green, permanently perfect, requiring no soil and no sunlight. The floors were polished terrazzo. The ceilings were high. And outside, rising above the parking lot, a 60-foot illuminated sign announced the mall's name to every car on the road. On clear nights, drivers on the Illinois Tollway could see it glowing from miles away. It was not just a sign. It was a declaration. Inland Construction Incorporated handled the build, and they moved fast. Ground broke in April 1965, and by October of that same year, before the mall was anywhere close to finished, Montgomery Ward opened its doors. 182,000 square feet across 2 floors, anchoring the east end of the complex. Ward's was not waiting for the rest of the mall to catch up. It was a department store with its own gravity, and the message was clear: this place was serious. The soft opening came on August 31, 1966. 36 stores were ready. The rest were still behind construction barriers, their storefronts draped in paper, but the ones that were open did their best to make it feel like an event. And the event had a headliner. Mel Torme, the Velvet Fog, one of the most recognizable voices in American popular music, appeared as the official presenter. He stood in the main concourse, surrounded by shoppers and local officials, and helped seal a time capsule that would not be open for 75 years. The capsule was placed somewhere on the property, a message from 1966 to the people of 2041. Nobody standing there that day could have imagined what would happen to the building long before that date arrived. The grand opening stretched across 3 days, November 10 through 12, 1966. More than 60 retailers opened their doors. JCPenney occupied 144,000 square feet on 2 levels at the west end. Woolworth was there. Walgreens, Jewel Supermarket, Fannie Mae Candy, Singer Sewing Center, Harvest House Restaurant. The concourses connected them all under one roof, and for the first time, the people of Harvey and the surrounding south suburbs could walk from a department store to a grocery store to a candy shop to a restaurant without ever stepping outside. The opening weekend was built to feel like a celebration. Homer and Jethro, the country comedy duo, performed free concerts in the common area. Uncle Ned Locke, a beloved figure from the Chicago children's television show Bozo's Circus, entertained kids while their parents browsed. Walgreens ran a promotion giving away a color television, still a luxury item in many households. Meyer Weiner himself offered a week-long vacation to Pine Point Resort in Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin. The parking lot held 4,200 cars, and on those 3 days it was full. Picture it. A November evening in 1966. The lot is packed. Families are walking through the main entrance, hit by a wall of warm air and soft light. Children are running ahead of their parents toward Uncle Ned. Somewhere down the concourse, Homer and Jethro are playing to a crowd that spills past the benches. The terrazzo floors shine. The imported plants look impossibly green. The black glass keeps the cold Illinois night invisible. Everything is new. Everything works. For the people of Harvey, who had spent their lives in a factory town built on sweat and prayer, this was something else entirely. This was the future, enclosed and air-conditioned and open 6 days a week, 9:30 in the morning to 9:30 at night. Nobody builds a building expecting it to die. And on those first nights, with the lights on and the crowds pouring in, the idea that Dixie Square Mall could fail must have seemed like the most absurd thought in the world. By October 1967, barely a year after the grand opening, Dixie Square Mall had already done something most shopping centers take a decade to achieve. Annual revenues crossed $40 million. That number was not a projection. It was not a target. It was what the registers actually rang up. Enough to make the Robert Meyer Corporation announce plans for a third anchor store before the mall had even celebrated its second birthday. Dixie Square was not just succeeding. It was pulling money out of the surrounding region like a drain in a bathtub. The proof showed up in somebody else's books. 20 miles to the south, Park Forest Plaza, a well-established shopping center that had served its community for years, watched its retail sales drop by 20% almost overnight. The village of Park Forest reported losing approximately $40,000 in sales tax revenue in the first quarter of 1967 alone. That money had not disappeared. It had driven north on Dixie Highway and walked through the doors of a building that was barely 12 months old. For the small towns and strip malls scattered across Chicago's south suburbs, Dixie Square had changed the math. You could keep your little plaza and your freestanding department store. The enclosed mall was the new gravity, and everything within driving distance was falling toward it. The expansion came in 1970. Turnstile Family Center, a discount department store that blended general merchandise with groceries, opened a new wing on the south side of the complex, adding more than 100,000 square feet of retail space. The mall's total enclosed footprint swelled to roughly 800,000 square feet. 64 stores now operated under one roof. 6 anchor tenants held down the corners. Montgomery Ward and JCPenney on opposite ends, each occupying 2 full floors. Woolworth along the main concourse. Walgreens and Jewel Supermarket with their own exterior entrances. And now Turnstile, pulling in a different kind of shopper. The budget-conscious family looking for a week's worth of groceries and a new set of curtains in the same trip. Together, those 6 anchors created a gravitational field that kept the smaller tenants between them alive. As long as the anchors drew crowds, the hallways stayed full, and the hallways were where the little shops, the shoe stores, the jewelers, the card shops, the hair salons, made their money. But Dixie Square was more than a collection of stores. It was, for a stretch of years in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the closest thing Harvey had to a town square. Teenagers met there after school and wandered the concourses with nowhere in particular to go. Couples went on dates to the Harvest House restaurant. Mothers pushed strollers past the storefront windows on weekday mornings. Retirees sat on the benches near the fountain and watched the crowds go by. On weekends, the parking lot filled by noon, and the hallways had the feel of a street fair, noisy, slow-moving, alive with the sound of people spending an afternoon in the only indoor public space for miles. The mall drew attention that went beyond retail. In the summer of 1968, Bobby Hull, the Chicago Blackhawks superstar, one of the most famous hockey players in the world, made an appearance at Dixie Square. The crowd that showed up was so large and so enthusiastic that it overwhelmed the mall's capacity to manage it. People packed the concourses shoulder to shoulder, pressing toward the roped-off area where Hull was signing autographs. It was the kind of scene that confirmed what the people of Harvey already believed. Their mall was not a local curiosity. It was a destination. And then there were the stories that belonged only to Dixie Square. In July 1973, multiple witnesses reported seeing unidentified flying objects hovering above the mall for roughly 40 minutes. Whether you believe the accounts or not, the fact that people were watching the sky above a shopping center in Harvey, Illinois, and reporting what they saw to local authorities says something about how central this building had become to the daily life of the community. It was the landmark. It was the reference point. If something strange was happening in Harvey, it was happening above the mall, because that was where everybody was looking. For those few golden years, Dixie Square was proof that the suburban dream worked. A factory town had built itself a gathering place, and the gathering place had become the heartbeat of the region. Revenue was up. Stores were full. The parking lot was never empty. And if you had stood in the main concourse on a Saturday afternoon in 1970 and told someone that this building would be dead within 8 years, they would have looked at you the way you look at someone who has lost their mind. But beneath the polished terrazzo and the fluorescent glow, forces were already in motion that no anchor store and no amount of revenue could hold back. Close your eyes for a moment and walk through the doors. The first thing you notice is the light. Not the harsh fluorescent buzz of a warehouse store, but something softer, filtered. Those black glass panels on the exterior walls, the ones the architects installed to cut glare, gave the interior a quality of light that people who shop there still talk about decades later. It was cool in tone, almost aquatic, as if the entire building existed in permanent shade. Your eyes adjusted and the concourse opened up before you, polished terrazzo underfoot, reflecting the ceiling lights in long, glassy streaks. The artificial plants lining the walkways looked greener than anything growing outside in the Illinois mud. They came from France, Germany, Japan. They never wilted, never browned, never dropped a leaf. In a town built on iron and steel, this was what luxury looked like. Then the smell hit you. Fannie Mae candy somewhere to your left. Warm chocolate and butter cutting through the climate-controlled air. A few steps further, the Harvest House restaurant, where the lunch crowd was already building by 11:30, the scent of grilled meat and coffee drifting out into the hallway. And beneath it all, the faint, clean smell of new construction. Fresh paint, sealant, the chemical sweetness of a building that had not yet had time to age. Piped-in music floated overhead, not loud enough to identify the song, just loud enough to fill the silence between footsteps. That sound, that soft, anonymous soundtrack, became so deeply associated with the place that years later, people who grew up shopping at Dixie Square would hear a certain kind of easy-listening melody in a dentist's office or an elevator and feel, for just a second, like they were 12 years old again, walking behind their mother toward Woolworth. The mall had its landmarks. Near the center of the main concourse sat a fountain built around a V8 engine, a sculpture that turned a piece of industrial machinery into a decorative centerpiece, water cascading over chrome and steel. It was strange and it was perfect, a blue-collar monument in a blue-collar town. Kids threw pennies into it and made wishes. Couples used it as a meeting point. For a few years, it was the most photographed object in Harvey, Illinois. There were places inside Dixie Square that existed nowhere else. City Life, a disco-style club, operated right inside the mall, the kind of place where teenagers from Harvey and the surrounding towns showed up on Saturday nights, paid a cover, and danced under colored lights while their parents browsed the department stores one floor away. It sounds impossible now, a nightclub inside a shopping mall. But in the early 1970s, the enclosed mall was still inventing itself, and nobody had written the rules yet about what could and could not happen inside one. And then there was the game. Pong. The simple, hypnotic tennis simulation that would launch the entire arcade industry made its Midwest debut right there in the main concourse of Dixie Square Mall. A cabinet appeared one day near the fountain, and within hours there was a line. Teenagers pumped quarters into it between trips to the record store. It was the first time many of them had ever touched a video game, and it happened not in some downtown arcade or a college campus, but in a shopping mall in Harvey, anchored between a candy store and a sewing machine shop. The mall ran 12 hours a day, Monday through Friday, 9:30 in the morning until 9:30 at night. Saturdays closed at 5:30. Sundays were up to individual tenants. Those hours meant that the building was alive for most of the waking day, every day of the week. A mother could drop off a prescription at Walgreens before her shift at 8, pick up groceries at Jewel after dinner, and still have time to stop at Woolworth for a birthday card on the way out. A kid could get dragged to JCPenney for school clothes in September, then beg to walk down to the arcade while his parents finished shopping. A retiree could spend an entire Tuesday afternoon on a bench near the fountain, watching people and feeling less alone. That was the Dixie Square Mall that lives in memory. Not a building, but a feeling, the specific warmth of a place that was always open, always lit, always populated with familiar faces doing ordinary things. The kind of place you stopped thinking about because it was simply there, like a street you drive every day. You only realize how much it mattered after it is gone. And by the mid-1970s, the world that had built Dixie Square and kept it alive was changing faster than anyone inside those black glass walls could see. The fountain was the first thing to go wrong. That V8 engine sculpture, the one kids threw pennies into, the one couples used as a meeting spot, rusted into what one former visitor later described as a wet pile of junk within a year of the mall's decline. The water stopped circulating, the chrome dulled. The pennies sat in a shallow pool of brown water that nobody bothered to drain. It was a small thing. Nobody closes a shopping mall because a fountain breaks. But if you wanted a single image to mark the moment Dixie Square began to die, the fountain would do. The deeper problem had nothing to do with plumbing. Harvey itself was changing, rapidly, visibly, and in ways that the mall's management had no power to reverse. In 1960, roughly 7% of the city's population was African American. By the early 1980s, that number had climbed to 66%. The shift did not happen gradually. Real estate agents in the south suburbs practiced a form of racial steering, directing black homebuyers toward the west side of Harvey, while quietly encouraging white families that it was time to move further south, further out, further away. The pattern had a name that everyone knew and nobody wanted to say out loud: white flight. It had already hollowed out neighborhoods on Chicago's south side, and now it was washing through the inner ring suburbs like a tide that only moved in one direction. The families leaving were not just taking their furniture. They were taking their paychecks, their property tax payments, and their shopping habits with them. A mall survives on foot traffic. Foot traffic depends on the population surrounding it. And when that population shifts, when the demographic that the anchor stores built their inventory around is replaced by a demographic with less disposable income, living in a community with a shrinking tax base, the math starts breaking down in ways that no renovation can fix. But before the math broke down, the violence arrived. In November 1972, a woman was fatally shot near the mall during a robbery attempt. In April 1973, another person was killed in a separate robbery. And in July of that same year, the same month witnesses reported UFOs hovering above the building, a teenage girl was strangled to death by 3 other teenagers inside the mall. 3 violent deaths in less than a year, all connected to a place that had been designed as a safe, climate-controlled escape from the outside world. The concourse where mothers had pushed strollers was now a place where people looked over their shoulders. Mall management responded the way businesses respond when they are scared but do not want to admit it. They spent money on the symptom instead of the disease. Security cameras went up, mounted 12 feet above the floor. The next evening, the cameras were stolen. Think about that for a moment. A security system designed to protect the mall, installed in the morning, stripped out by nightfall. The gesture itself, the attempt to watch and the immediate proof that nobody was afraid of being watched, captured the entire situation more precisely than any revenue report or demographic study ever could. In late July 1975, management tried something desperate. They renamed the mall. Dixie Square became simply Dixie Mall, as if shedding a word could shed a reputation. They poured money into renovations and reopened on October 9, 1975, hoping for a fresh start. The fresh start lasted about a year. Montgomery Ward, the anchor that had opened before the mall itself was finished, the store that had been there since October 1965, closed its doors on October 4, 1976. 182,000 square feet of prime retail space went dark. When an anchor store leaves an enclosed mall, it does not just remove one business. It removes the reason half the hallway exists. The smaller stores between the anchor and the rest of the complex lose their foot traffic overnight. Corridors that once carried shoppers from Ward's to Woolworth became dead ends that nobody walked down. Turnstile followed in January 1978. The newest anchor, the one that was supposed to signal growth, expansion, momentum, lasted 8 years. The Illinois Retail Merchants Association released a report on November 23, 1978, estimating that $130 million in merchandise had been stolen from Chicago area malls in 1977 alone. The report named Dixie Square directly. Dixie Square had to close down because of these losses, it stated. Between 1976 and 1978, mall management spent $1 million on security. $1 million to guard a building that was bleeding tenants, bleeding customers, and bleeding money from every corridor. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. In November 1978, 12 years after Mel Torme sealed a time capsule and Homer and Jethro played to a cheering crowd, the lights inside Dixie Square Mall went off for the last time. But dying and being dead are two different things. And Dixie Square was about to learn that the hard way. JCPenney was the last anchor to leave. In January 1979, 2 months after the main mall went dark, the department store that had occupied 144,000 square feet on 2 floors issued a statement citing sharply declining sales and profits and pulled out. The language was corporate and bloodless, the kind of sentence written by a lawyer, not a person. But what it described was a retreat. The biggest store left standing had looked at the numbers, looked at the empty hallways, looked at the parking lot where weeds were already pushing through the asphalt, and decided that staying was worse than walking away. Walgreens and Jewel, both with their own exterior entrances, both technically able to operate without the mall's internal foot traffic, held on until the spring of 1979. Then they left too. And 800,000 square feet of enclosed retail space sat empty. What happened next belongs to a category of American stories that nobody plans for, the kind where a building that was supposed to serve a community becomes a burden that the community cannot afford to remove. In January 1979, the property was donated to the Harvey Dixmoor School District 147. Donated sounds generous until you learn that the gift came with $800,000 in unpaid taxes and outstanding mortgage payments. The school district, already underfunded, already struggling, took on a dead mall and its debts because nobody else would. They converted part of the turnstile wing into a gymnasium. For 2 years, children went to school inside a shopping mall that no longer had any shops. They walked past empty storefronts to get to class. They played basketball in a room that had been designed to sell discount curtains. It was resourceful and it was heartbreaking, and it was the kind of solution that only exists when every better option has already failed. Then Hollywood called. In the summer of 1979, Universal Pictures leased the abandoned mall for director John Landis, who was shooting a film called The Blues Brothers. The production team needed a location for a car chase, not a set, but a real building they could drive through and destroy. Dixie Square was perfect. It was enormous. It was empty, and nobody was going to complain about the damage. Landis and his crew spent weeks transforming the dead mall into something that looked alive. They built fake storefronts where real ones had been. A Toys R Us sign went up in a space where no Toys R Us had ever existed. Display cases were filled with merchandise that would be smashed on camera. The concourse that had been silent for months was suddenly full of lights and crew members and stunt drivers rehearsing their lines through the corridors. When the cameras rolled, the Bluesmobile, a 1974 Dodge Monaco, tore through the building at speed, crashing through glass, demolishing display cases, sending mannequins flying. police cars followed, piling into storefronts and skidding across the terrazzo. It was chaotic and funny and spectacular, and when the film was released on June 20, 1980, the mall chase became one of the most iconic sequences in American comedy. The scene made people laugh. It made Dixie Square famous. And it sealed the building's identity forever, not as the place where Bobby Hull signed autographs or where kids played Pong for the first time, but as the place where Jake and Elwood Blues drove a car through a wall. The school district did not find it as entertaining. On December 17, 1981, Harvey Dixmoor School District 147 sued Universal Studios for $87,000, claiming the production had damaged ceiling tiles, door locks, windows, and lighting fixtures. The lawsuit captured something painfully absurd about the entire situation. A school district that was holding classes in a dead mall was now suing a movie studio for breaking the dead mall further. After the film crew left and the lawsuit settled, nobody was watching the building anymore. In 1984, the first vandals broke in. By 1985, every remaining piece of glass in the structure had been shattered. Every piece of metal worth anything, copper wiring, brass fittings, fire hose connectors, had been stripped and sold for scrap. The imported plants from France and Germany and Japan were long gone. The terrazzo floors were covered in broken glass and standing water. The canvas awning over the food court area was torn down and hauled away. Through the 1990s, the building became something worse than abandoned. It became occupied by gangs, by drug activity, by violence that had no witnesses and left no records. In July 1993, a woman named Denise Shelby was raped and murdered inside the former JCPenney store. A man named Raymond Eves was convicted and sentenced to life in prison in October 1997. A woman died in the same space where families had once bought school clothes and Christmas presents, and the building just absorbed it the way a ruin absorbs rain, silently, indifferently, without any capacity left to hold anything sacred. 3 decades after closing, Dixie Square still stood, rotting, dangerous, and more famous than it had ever been while it was alive. Here is a question that sounds simple until you try to answer it. How do you demolish a building that nobody owns, nobody wants, and nobody can afford to tear down? Dixie Square Mall closed in November 1978. It was not fully demolished until May 2012, 34 years. A child born the year the lights went off could have had children of their own by the time the last wall came down. And in the space between those two dates, a parade of politicians, developers, and civic dreamers each took their turn promising to fix the problem. And each one failed in ways that would be funny if they were not so devastating to the people who had to live next to the wreckage. The first redevelopment plan surfaced in 1985. It went nowhere. Another appeared in 1989, same result. A third was announced in 1997, nothing. Each plan followed the same script: a press conference, an artist rendering, a set of ambitious numbers, and then silence. The plans did not fail because the site was worthless. They failed because the site was poisoned, legally, financially, environmentally, in ways that no rendering could cover up: unpaid taxes, disputed ownership, environmental contamination. A community with no tax base to subsidize the gap between what a developer needed and what the land could support. Every time someone tried to pick up the pieces, they discovered that the pieces had more edges than they expected. In March 2000, Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr. organized a march from Dixie Square Mall to Homewood Flossmoor High School, calling for a third major airport in the Chicago area as a way to revitalize Harvey and the south suburbs. It was a grand vision, a federal infrastructure project that would bring jobs, investment, and relevance back to a community that had been losing all three for decades. The march made the news. The airport never materialized. And Dixie Square kept rotting. Then came 2005, and the story tipped from tragedy into something closer to farce. A company called American Kitchen Delights purchased the former Montgomery Ward building for $100,000 and began demolition. There was just one problem. They did not test for hazardous materials first. On June 23, 2005, debris from the site tested positive for asbestos. Workers had been tearing apart a contaminated structure without protection, sending fibers into the air of a residential neighborhood. 5 days later, Illinois Attorney General Lisa Madigan filed a lawsuit against American Kitchen Delights, its owner Shanawaz Hassan, and the city of Harvey for allowing the work to proceed without proper oversight. A second lawsuit followed in December, adding more defendants and threatening fines of up to $50,000 per violation. But the most surreal chapter came on Christmas Eve 2005. A demolition crew, operating under unclear authority and even less clear supervision, destroyed roughly 60% of the Montgomery Ward structure before Mayor Eric Kellogg discovered what was happening. The mayor later told reporters that he happens to be driving by when he spotted the crew at work and ordered them to stop. Christmas Eve. A demolition crew tearing apart an asbestos-contaminated building while most of Harvey was home with their families. And the only reason it stopped was because the mayor happened to take a drive. The following February, a developer named John Deneen purchased the entire Dixie Square property through his company, Emerald Property Group, for $500,000. Deneen announced a $250 million redevelopment, retail, commercial, a complete transformation. The press conference was hopeful, the renderings were beautiful, and within months the project collapsed. Environmental lawsuits piled up. Contractors filed liens exceeding $1 million for unpaid work. Deneen himself faced criminal charges including weapons violations and intimidation. By May 2006, his demolition crew packed up and left because there was no more money to pay them. The site sat untouched. Meanwhile, nature was doing its own demolition. Saplings pushed through the collapsed roof of the old Woolworth store, growing toward sunlight that had never been meant to reach the floor. Rainwater pooled in the corridors and froze in winter, cracking the terrazzo that shoppers had once walked across in their Sunday shoes. In July 2009, a fire of unknown origin collapsed the roof of Block C. Urban explorers, photographers, and adventurers drawn to abandoned spaces broke in with cameras and documented what they found. Their images spread across the internet. Hallways choked with debris, trees growing through ceilings, faded signs still reading, "Thank you. Please come again." Dixie Square became the poster child of the Dead Mall movement, more photographed in death than it had ever been in life. It took a $4 million federal grant, announced by Governor Pat Quinn in September 2010, to finally break the cycle. Permits were issued in January 2012. Asbestos remediation was completed. And on May 17, 2012, the last piece of Dixie Square Mall was pulled from the earth. The demolition cost roughly $5 million, nearly as much, adjusted for inflation, as the original construction. But even after the building vanished, the story refused to end. The 39 acres where Dixie Square Mall once stood are empty now. Not empty the way a field is empty, open and waiting for rain. Empty the way a wound is empty. The soil is classified as brownfield land, which is a polite way of saying the ground itself is contaminated. Weeds grow through the dirt where 4,200 cars once parked in neat rows. The city has talked about building a cold storage warehouse on the site, a distribution hub for online grocery delivery. If that happens, the land where families once walked through 60 stores on a Saturday afternoon will become a place where robots sort frozen food into cardboard boxes for people who never leave their homes. The symbolism is almost too neat. The town square of 1966 becomes the supply chain of the 21st century. The place where people gathered becomes the place where people are no longer needed. Harvey itself tells the rest of the story. The population that peaked near 35,000 has fallen to roughly 20,000. More than a third of the residents live below the poverty line. More than 1,000 properties sit vacant and abandoned, houses, storefronts, lots returning to prairie. In 2018, Harvey became the first city in Illinois to have its state revenue garnished to cover unpaid pension obligations. The factories that built the town are gone. Whiting Corporation, which had been making cranes in Harvey since 1894, closed its doors in 2000 after more than a century. Wyman Gordon, Alice Chalmers, the Arco Research Lab, all gone. The tax base that funded the schools and the police and the fire department evaporated with them, and what remains is a community that has been asked to solve problems it did not create with resources it does not have. It is tempting when telling the story of Dixie Square to reach for a clean explanation. The internet killed them all. Online shopping made it obsolete. But Dixie Square closed in 1978. The World Wide Web did not exist for another 15 years. Amazon was not founded until 1994. The forces that killed this mall had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with the way America builds communities and then abandons them. White flight drained the customer base. Deindustrialization drained the paychecks. Racial steering concentrated poverty in neighborhoods that had been designed for prosperity. Competing malls in wealthier suburbs pulled away whatever foot traffic remained. And management, faced with rising crime, falling revenue, and a building that was aging faster than its tenants could maintain, responded too slowly, too cautiously, and too late. Dixie Square did not die from one cause. It died from the accumulation of every structural failure that post-war American suburbia was built to ignore. And then there is the Blues Brothers paradox. The 1980 film made Dixie Square Mall one of the most recognizable dead buildings in the country. Millions of people have seen Jake and Elwood crash through its corridors. The scene is funny, it is thrilling, it is endlessly rewatchable. But it also froze the mall in the public imagination as a place that was already dead. A prop, a punchline, a set piece for destruction. The people who search for Dixie Square online find the car chase. They do not find the woman who got her portrait taken at Sears in 1967 and kept the photograph for decades. They do not find the teenagers who played Pong for the first time in the main concourse. They do not find the families who ate at Harvest House on Friday nights or the kids who danced at City Life on Saturdays. The film preserved the building's corpse and erased its life, and that erasure, the replacement of lived experience with spectacle, is its own kind of loss. The enclosed shopping mall was never just a retail format. It was a promise. A promise that the suburbs could have everything the city had: community, culture, a place to belong, without the density, the noise, the inconvenience of urban life. Victor Gruen, the architect who started it all, envisioned his malls as modern town squares, gathering places where strangers would become neighbors. Developers took his vision and stripped it down to a revenue model, but the people who shopped in those malls did not know that. They just knew it felt good to be inside. Warm in winter, cool in summer, safe, familiar. Full of people doing the same ordinary things you were doing. When that feeling disappeared, when the anchor stores left and the hallways emptied and the lights went off, what vanished was not just a business. It was a way of being together in a country that has always struggled to find places where that can happen. On a stretch of Dixie Highway in Harvey, Illinois, the wind blows across 39 acres of bare ground. There is no sign marking what stood here, no plaque, no memorial. Just dirt and weeds and the low hum of traffic passing by on its way to somewhere else. And somewhere buried under that dirt, or lost in a landfill, or sitting in a forgotten storage room, a 75-year time capsule sealed by Mel Torme in 1966 is still waiting to be opened. It was supposed to be unsealed in 2041. Whether anyone will remember where to find it, or whether anyone will care, is a question that Dixie Square Mall can no longer answer.